here. Thanks for coming today. My name is Mike Payne. I'm the Executive Director at Nine Circles Community Health Center just up the street. I'm the Administrative Lead for the Manitoba HIV program, but today I'm really just the proud co-lead along with Laurie Ringaert, who is right over there. Laurie, raise your hand. For the Manitoba HIV program Collective Impact Network. And we're so excited to have all of you here. Because of my fancy title, I get the best job, which is really to thank you guys for coming. We're so excited that you're here. Looking forward to really a day of learning and sharing and working together and enjoying an opportunity to connect with people who care about what's happening in the world of HIV and really want to make a difference. It's rare we get a chance to get together like this, and so we want to celebrate that as well as make the most of the day in terms of creating our pathway forward. We have officially 105 registered participants, as I know folks are coming into the room, folks from all over the province and from across the country, a beautiful diversity of experiences that we can share today, and so I really encourage people to take the opportunity to do that. I also want to welcome the folks who are coming on through live stream. Hi, Mom, and anyone else who may be in there. Please know for folks in the audience that the live stream is directed at the speakers, and it will be consistently directed at the speakers throughout the morning. So if you're in the audience and you're thinking, I don't really want to be live streamed, you're not being, so you don't need to worry about that. And the live stream is just for the morning. So when we work into smaller groups this afternoon, that won't be present either. So just so you're aware of that and not concerned. My second job, aside from welcoming you, is to kind of give you an orientation to the space and the day. So that's what I'm going to do for you today, and then we will go from there. So first and foremost, always important, washrooms. Go out this door, and to your left, you're going to find some gendered washrooms just around the corner. Those are the closest ones. There are more, but they're a bit of a walk, so you may choose to just stay in this area for now. If you need to find another washroom, you can follow the network signs. There's little posters along the way, and eventually you will find yourself another set of bathrooms. Myself and Laurie, and anyone else here who's helping out, we're wearing little either yellow or green cards. We've been debating that all day. Either one of those folks will either be able to answer any questions that you have, or they'll be able to direct you someone that can. So just look for the cards if you're needing help. Folks with lived experience who are expecting or were offered support in order to participate today, I'm your guy to talk to, and I'll be in this room all day, and for much of the day I'll be sitting in the back corner at the registration desk, so when you're ready you can just come by and see me and we'll get everything sorted out. The last little housewarming thing I'm going to do is just acknowledge that it's going to get warm in here probably. It's getting warm outside, and this is an old building, so it may get warm, but that's okay because the plan this afternoon is to be able to walk around and move around, so we'll get that sorted. We're good so far. All right, so why are we here? Because HIV remains a grumbling epidemic, as a quote from my colleague, Dr. Casper, that despite our best efforts, keeps a stubborn hold on our province and keeps us remaining as a province with the second highest incidence of HIV in this country. As importantly, many people who are living with HIV still face great barriers to health, to wellness, and to social inclusion, and there are really complex reasons why that's still happening. Complex reasons that individually are difficult to solve, but collectively we may be able to have a real impact on. So we invite and welcome people who want to make a difference in this issue to come together and explore ways to do that. The Manitoba Collective Impact Network itself is a network of innovators working collaboratively to transform the landscape of Manitoba, or HIV in Manitoba. So that's why you're here. We're looking at complex HIV, STBBI system barriers and trying to tackle those, in many cases by affecting systems change. When we talk about systems change, this is what we're talking about. Shifting the conditions that are holding the problems in place, making a change in those. And when we talk about that, we wanted to give a shout out to Shauna Isley and some of her colleagues from the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network, who about a month ago had a conference that really was focusing on HIV and reconciliation and how those things relate. And that's an example of a group of folks trying to shake things up and make a shift. And so that's the kind of action and leadership that we want to continue to kind of move forward as we go along. So what will our day kind of look like today then as we shape that pathway to action? Folks probably know if you've been involved in the network before, but if you haven't, I'll let you know. We have some existing action groups. As we've evolved, action groups have formed as people have described the kinds of things that they want to tackle. Laurie's going to give you some more information this afternoon about where those action groups are and some of the things that they're working on to really take our ideas and our knowledge and turn that into action. So today, we're really going to focus on learning and sharing and taking opportunities to generate new ideas and opportunities for change throughout the day. So that's really what this is about. There'll be no quizzes or tests, but it's really just an opportunity to open our minds and listen to each other and think about how we can move ourselves forward. Our goal, to share knowledge about innovation, or innovative regional, national, and provincial approaches to address HIV issues and explore local solutions. We have some objectives which we've sent to you, but we want to build on innovative ideas from across the country, share information about local initiatives, the things that we're already doing that are having an impact or could have an impact. We want to foster a creation of new partnerships and always be looking for opportunities to work better together. So specifically, this is the day. In the morning, we're going to hear from folks who are going to contribute or who contribute research to help guide our collective efforts. Work that's both meaningful to the community and helping to answer questions or solve problems, and work in these cases that makes a concerted effort to meaningfully engage the people that they're supporting, particularly individuals who are living with HIV. In the lunch period, we're going to have an idea market. It's setting up over there. This is a space where people who want to contribute in a different way are able to contribute through posters and other kind of forms of information. Also, opportunities to share with you what people are learning, share their ideas or questions, and generate some ideas and excitement about how we can move forward together. You also have a passport in your little red package. So over lunch, if you're looking at the posters, there'll be people standing by the posters and talking about their projects. They'll also be stamping your passport while you're doing that, and there's a little bit of a draw for a prize. So you'll drop in your passport, I think, at the front is how that works. And then after lunch, we're going to share in groups in areas of particular interest, but Laurie will talk to you a bit about that after lunch, so I won't go into big details about that at this point. I want to take the chance now to thank first our funders. The Public Health Agency of Canada and Reach 2.0 give us both program money and some staffing that help us kind of pull all of this together and make this event happen, and also give us some transportation money that have allowed us to help bring folks from out of Winnipeg into this space to be part of our event today. And I want to thank our partners on this particular symposium, the National Collaborating Center on Infectious Diseases, or NCCID. I never can say it the right way because it's just NCCID, but these folks have given us some resources to help for the event today. They've been super helpful, along with our partners here at University of Winnipeg, in figuring out the live stream, which we've really appreciated. That's been a goal for us for a long time. And also have given us access to Geneviève, but we'll talk about her in a bit. Thanks as well to the Collective Impact Network Stewardship Committee. There's a list of those people in your folder if you're curious. All of these individuals who come from academic and government and non-government and agency bodies come together to design and plan these events. And you'll notice, as you see the little yellow cards around, most of the people who are doing the work today are people who are actively involved in the Stewardship Committee as well. So there'll be good people to engage with, not only to help you through the day, but also to share ideas and make new connections. Joining us today, just so folks know, is an amazing group of students, as well as a group of volunteers and staff from Nine Circles. So we thank them very much for helping us out today as well. A couple more quick things. You're going to notice sticky notes. Is that true? Yeah, sticky notes on your table. So folks who have been at Collective Impact Network events before, you know what these are. You're going to be listening to people talk. You're going to be making connections with other people. You're going to get new ideas or new questions that may come up. I wish we knew more about this, or I wish I better understood that. I'd like to hear more about what that person spoke about. Write them down on the cards. We're going to stick them on the wall later. It's really just a way to pull all of our ideas together. We use those ideas pretty consistently. They often frame the topics of the future events that come up. And so don't be shy about writing down what you think is important, or if something really stuck with you that day, we'll condense that. You'll see everybody's ideas when we send information back to you, and it also helps us in our planning. There's always, of course, an evaluation. It's in your package. It's at the back. We'll bug you about it all day long because that's what we do. What I would recommend is take the evaluation, make notes on it throughout the day. It helps me when I do that to be able to reflect at the end of the day more accurately, especially when I'm a little bit tired. And it'll speed up the process of completing the evaluation, and then you wouldn't have any reason why you couldn't do that. And there's a draw prize attached to the evaluation as well. And then before I make my first introduction, because that's the last thing I get to do is make the first introduction, I want us to take just a couple of minutes and for you guys to meet each other. In case you haven't had a chance to do that, we've randomly placed you at tables, and as expected, you have completely ignored us and sat wherever you want, and that's okay. But please take a couple minutes to introduce yourselves around the table, because a part of this event is about connecting and getting to know people. The discussion now. This is always the risk. So I'm just going to start talking, and you guys are going to finish up. That's awesome. So I get to make the first introductions of the day, and then you won't have to listen to me very much anymore after that. So I mentioned briefly that we have support for this event from our colleagues at NCCID, which we're greatly appreciative of. One of the other contributions we have, or gifts through the NCCID, is Geneviève, Boily-Larouche, and I knew I was going to mess that up, so I even practiced. Geneviève is a senior program manager at the National Collaborating Center for Infectious Diseases. She is an enthusiastic scientist and with an interdisciplinary approach. First trained in basic science through her doctoral and postdoctoral research on the mechanisms of HIV transmission in sub-Saharan Africa, Geneviève now works in knowledge translation with a goal of accelerating the use of research evidence to improve public health practices and policy in the area of STBBIs. Geneviève is also the newest member of our Collective Impact Network Stewardship Committee and has brought enormous, wonderful ideas and energy to the team, and so we're really grateful to have her, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. I do appreciate your very nice presentation and for the effort of my name, Geneviève Boily-Larouche. Okay, hi everyone, good morning. I would like first to begin by acknowledging that, I'm too short for that, we are in Treaty 1 territory. The land in which we gather today is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people in the homeland of the Métis Nation. So I'm very happy to be here today on the behalf of the National Collaborating Center for Infectious Disease, or the NCCID. For those who don't know us, we are a national knowledge broker, which means that we have the mandate to help public health stakeholders in their journey to improve practice and policies in Canada. So in short, what it means is that we identify knowledge gaps and solutions, we spark ideas, we connect people that can help each other, and we also create bridges across sectors, jurisdictions, and disciplines. So all of this we do because we want to enable change and support evidence-based practice all across the country in Canada. So in that spirit, we were very pleased to partner with the Manitoba HIV Collective Impact Network to bring all of you today together so we can encourage innovative thinking around HIV response in this province, but also we can create an opportunity to bring all of our knowledge and experience to improve the life of those who are affected and live with HIV in this province. So by partnering for this event, NCCID is contributing to that bridge building for Manitoba because we help bringing great people from outside that province and connecting other people. And then that's part of like what we like to do and we're happy to do. So we really hope that today will inspire everyone to imagine the change that they want to see, but also provide the knowledge and the connection that would help make it happen. So without any further ado, I'm happy to introduce Elder Peetanacoot Nenakawekapo. So she is Anishinaabe of the Ojibwe Nation from the Wolf Clan. She is a two-spirit person and a trans woman from Skonan, Manitoba, residing in Winnipeg. She is fluent in Ojibwe, the second eldest of 10 children, and gets encouragement from her family for the works she does throughout Canada and beyond. An activist for over 30 years, Peetanacoot has worked to bring attention to gay indigenous rights, women's rights, and the right of people living with HIV. Peetanacoot has been living with HIV for over 27 years. She was inspired by her partner, Gordon, who passed away from HIV-related illness in 1999. Gordon encouraged Peetanacoot to be active in community-based education and prevention. She works as a cultural support worker at Ninth Circle, where she provides support and is supported by people living with HIV and their family and friends. She is a pipe carrier and a hand drum keeper. Humbly, she is recognized as an elder in the community. Peetanacoot also works as an Aboriginal traditional advisor and at the Aboriginal Health and Wellness Center. So welcome and come here and give us some words. Thank you.
Hey, good morning. There's not much to introduce myself. There's a lot of introduction that's being done already. But I can truly say it in my language. I'll be doing a lot of that stuff in Ojibwe. There will be no translation. But I would like to say welcome to the Treaty 1 of the Anishinaabe, Oji-Cree, Ojibwe, Cree, Dene, Dakota, and Métis Nation, the homeland of the Métis Nation here in Winnipeg. I'm honored to be here today to be able to assist here. I was asked to come and do an opening today, and I'll also be doing the closing. And I also like to welcome the people who are from the province and also throughout Canada. It's really good to be here, to be able to be here, and also to be very informed or work together to make things matter for this HIV that we're impacted by. So I'm going to speak in my language now. Abushu Peetanacoot digu mengan dotem skonaning dochiba kimigochibigu manim shum senanik nokum senanik kagishimini goisiang wenongum kagishi kinamuyang jishchigang we akosiwen gaya maknim skuminaning kegachuni kesiang we gaya kandonokiang kagishimini goisiang we jishchigang anokiwin and sagishik deinaning chipme chigang kinegego ani minon denane minaga menu kimaga kawik ani nigo kawikego kaishi pisikenda bang kishigeng ani nuwe shigagi tog ani nigo shwawi chitiang chiwi chitiang kinegego omachi shimina semagak ani nigo yo nananda kap mayat wadonju wabanong shonong kiwetnong antigo magap mayat toyos nigabonong Kichikishik making out in the Kesiang Shigang and the Sagishik, Kin Mishumisananik, Nokumisananik, Ishikinamuyang, where Sagishik Chishigang, where guys Chigang Nandoke up Metashindaman, up me, Mamobiang, Kinege, Wachik, Minasemagak, Aninigo, which Ishigang, Kakina Moyang Kinegego, Chinishikeno Ishiang Kinegego, Kegatu in the Kesiang, Mishumisananik, Nokumisananik, where guys Mayang Nokum, Consumegachigan Kinegego, where guys Chigang, where I Thank you for giving me that opportunity to share my prayer here. Miigwech.
Thank you very much for your words. Now, I am pleased to introduce our Master of Ceremony for the day, Mr. Ken Bristrow. Ken has been living with HIV in Manitoba for more than 15 years. He has been an active member of the board of Nine Circle Community Health Center for the past decade. Ken enjoys traveling throughout Manitoba, working as a community educator in HIV prevention. In his previous role, he had been a board chair of the Manitoba PHA caucus and a board member for Katie. Ken is currently working as a research associate for the HIV Stigma and Discrimination Project in Manitoba. Ken, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I guess it's time to get the show on the road. So, welcome to our panel session for this morning, sharing on innovations to facilitate our pathway to action. I'm pleased to emcee this panel and introduce each of the presenters before they do their little show. Each presentation will be about 20 minutes, and then we'll have an interactive session afterwards. So to start, I'm going to introduce Leigh McCarty. I hope I said that right. Is a PhD candidate in the Center for Global Public Health at the University of Manitoba. Through her doctoral research, Leigh aims to develop a more holistic understanding of HIV epidemiology in Manitoba, with specific focus on programming that can support engagement and care for people living with HIV in the province. Leigh will speak today with us on operationalizing program science for HIV response in Manitoba.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. And thanks to the organizers as well for having me here. I feel lucky and slightly out of my league, but that's okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about program science, specifically operationalizing program science for HIV response in Manitoba. I'll go through a little bit of an outline. Sorry, I'm just going to try and position myself here. So as a bit of an outline for what I plan to talk about, I'm going to begin with I'm going to begin with a bit of an introduction on program science. I don't quite know where everyone's at in terms of whether they've ever heard of program science or if you know about it really well and you're completely clear on it, but I'm just going to try to get everyone on the same page and talk a little bit about what it is and where it came from, what a program science framework looks like, and how it's different than other frameworks and how it can complement them as well. Then the second part of my presentation will focus more on operationalizing program science with very brief discussion about how it's been applied in the past, and then we can talk, just sort of go through a hypothetical exercise about how it could be put to action in Manitoba. Okay, so a brief primer on program science. Program science is essentially a iterative, multi-phase research and program framework in which programs drive scientific inquiry. So it's kind of introduced to the literature around 2011 by Jamie Blanchard and Sev Guillerol in a paper in Sexually Transmitted Infections. And in that paper, they define program science as the systematic application of theoretical and empirical scientific knowledge to improve the design, implementation, and evaluation of public health programs. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's kind of the most comprehensive definition that's out there. Ultimately, program science does just aim to maximize population-level impact of programs by optimizing the choice of the right strategies or interventions for the right populations at the right time. I wanted to go through some assumptions or theoretical underpinnings of the framework. So when we talk about public health programs in the context of program science, we understand that they're complex systems with emergent properties. So programs change over time as needed and sometimes unexpectedly. A program would comprise of multiple components or interventions that are all tailored to a specific context. And public health programs place emphasis on optimizing population-level impact. So in terms of background, program science didn't come out of nowhere. There was a commentary published in 2010 by Parkhurst and colleagues talking about getting research into policy or practice versus getting research out of practice. So they sort of coined the terms GRIP and GROP, which are charming. I have the figure from the commentary here. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but maybe it will help to sort of follow along. But basically the GRIP track, which stands for Getting Research into Practice, requires that there's sort of a body of solid evidence in existence before any action can be taken to address a public health issue. So as probably a lot of us know, working in applied public health, that's not always possible when we're facing immediate health challenges. So we don't always have the right kind of evidence or strong enough evidence to be certain about anything in public health. So in those cases, Parkhurst and colleagues suggested that we turn to sort of the GROP track, which stands for Getting Research Out of Practice. And through the GROP track, we think about using sort of programmatic knowledge, so not empirical evidence, not evidence that's derived from rigorous scientific methodologies, but from programs which is rooted in experience and basically tangible sort of knowledge. And we use that to inform intervention development. So in the absence of empirical evidence or evidence coming out of research, intervention should be developed based on a strong conceptual basis, which can absolutely come from programming, and should involve rigorous program evaluation protocols. So when program science tries to kind of bridge the gap between the GRIP and GROP tracks. And within a program science framework, scientists, program implementers, and policymakers can work collaboratively so that programs and practice can inform research, and in turn, research can inform programs and practice and policy. And another thing about program science, which isn't highlighted as much in the GRIP and GROP tracks, is that program science frameworks really try to center programs as both sort of a source of and a sink for new knowledge and innovation. So this is, I guess, a depiction of the theoretical frameworks and sort of illustration. Program science sort of is made up of 3 spheres of practice. The first being strategic planning, which centers on making informed decisions about identifying and setting program priorities and planning for resource allocation. So within strategic planning, we want to try to get a better understanding of local epidemiological context. So this would include understanding transmission dynamics. So, sorry, I should mention that when I'm talking about program science, I'm going to mostly be talking about HIV, but it's not the only context that program science could be used. To understand local epidemiological context, that means understanding transmission dynamics, understanding demographics of folks who are impacted by the epidemic, and also understanding the geography of an epidemic. So sometimes there's geographical areas that are more are disproportionately impacted by epidemics. The next sphere of practice would be program implementation. So in this realm, we sort of think about making informed decisions about where, what, how, and for whom interventions should be delivered. And we use knowledge of local epidemiology, which was developed hopefully in the previous sphere, and we use that to inform our decisions about which interventions we want to choose to include within a program. And this is a really important part where engagement with community and relevant stakeholders is critical, so that we know that the choices we're making for interventions are acceptable and appropriate for our local context. Finally, third sphere is program management, monitoring, and evaluation. So I think for a lot of us who work within programs, we know the importance of monitoring programs and evaluating them. Program science agrees with you. Within this framework, we really focus on sort of the iterative nature, or the necessarily making evaluation an iterative process, so doing it over and over, not just once in the course of a program. And I'll talk more about this later, so I'm gonna not focus on that. But there's, that's sort of an illustration that hopefully will stay in your mind through the rest of the presentation. And just to summarize, program science essentially uses programmatic and scientific evidence, monitors it to inform program planning and implementation to accommodate the evolving needs of a program and its primary users. Okay, so there's always questions around the difference between program science and implementation science and other sorts of frameworks that sound really similar to this. So I have a few examples of how they're different, but also I don't think we need to focus on pitting different frameworks against each other. It's not super helpful for anyone, but implementation science is typically talking about a single intervention and focuses on sort of scaling up an intervention in an effective way. So that's important within the program science framework as well, but program science is usually concerned with the totality of a program. It also includes sort of the monitoring and evaluation piece, which isn't always included within an implementation science framework. And it also emphasizes the importance of stakeholder involvement throughout all stages of program development and implementation. Another common question is, isn't program science just good program management? And yes, yes it is. But it also goes beyond that a little bit in that it seeks to develop new insights and knowledge from the operations of programs. New knowledge can emerge in many different areas within a program, which I've listed, but I don't need to go through specifically, I don't think. So there I tried to cover some anticipated questions, but Of course, I can try and answer more if there are some later. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about operationalizing program science, or sort of applying it in a real life setting, because I think it can help sort of understand why we think program science is kind of a good idea. But before I talk about the Manitoba context, which is really where I want to focus, I just want to highlight that a program science framework has been, as I mentioned, most commonly used for HIV and STBBI prevention programs, but it's also been applied to programs that provide services along the maternal, newborn, and child health care continuum. But importantly, it's most commonly been applied outside of the Canadian context. So what I want to do in the rest of the presentation is talk a little bit about, or sort of bring it home, and talk about how we might be able to use program science within Manitoba. So a little bit of background. This is a care cascade that was developed based on clients who entered into care with the Manitoba HIV program in 2016. So this is by no means a representation of the entire clinic population, or program population, but this is encompasses about 100 folks, and the numbers aren't actually important for my example, but what I wanted to highlight was that sort of opportunity gaps that we can identify through the care cascade framework. So we can see in the last three sort of steps of the care cascade that if we had really high expectations for ourselves and wanted to hit 100% target for every cascade step, that we have some substantial room for improvement in the sort of retain to care, on treatment, and suppress viral load steps of the cascade. So I'm going to use this example as we move forward and look at a hypothetical exercise. Okay, so what my plan is here is to go through the sort of three spheres of program science that I introduced before, and talk about how we can use the framework to develop a program in Manitoba. So the first step would be to identify program priorities. So as I highlighted earlier, or a second ago really, we saw that sort of in the realm of engagement to care, which encompasses the retained in care, on treatment, and suppressed viral load steps of the cascade, that there's some room for improvement. So let's say, for example, that would be a goal for the Manitoba HIV program, to improve overall engagement in HIV care in Manitoba. So once we identify that priority, we can start to understand local context, and as I mentioned before, that would include understanding characteristics of the local epidemic in terms of who it's impacting, and the needs that are not maybe being met among people accessing care, or for instance, people who are not accessing care. So I think it's important to think about when we look at a cascade like this is aggregate data, so this is everyone who entered into care in 2016, but of course within that group of folks there's a lot of variation. So if we could disaggregate this cascade and make many different ones, looking at looking at the cascade among different age groups, or people living within the city or outside of the city. And so I think we would see really different cascades depending on how we decided to break out the data. And so that would be one way, that's one way that program science can help us look at complexities within an epidemic, and look at heterogeneity or variations within different indicators of interest. So once we understand local context, which takes a really long time and is a lot of work, I should note, I kind of just rushed through it, but that's a really big part of preparing for a program. Next, we think about resource allocation, the kinds of resources that are around and available for a program. And this is an important part where we want to think about partnerships. So the Manitoba HIV program is one program among many incredible organizations in the province. So coming together always makes the most sense, of course. So we think about partnerships and funding, and then we want to always keep in mind how we can allocate resources to maximize population level impact. Next, we want to identify potential interventions to address the specific gaps in the care cascade that we saw. So again, we make these decisions based on the local context, and we have to consider which interventions will work nicely together. And we can't always know that up front, and we sometimes realize that maybe separate interventions don't work well together once we go through the monitoring and evaluation process. And we also want to develop context-specific service delivery strategies for each component intervention. And this is, again, a really important place where engagement with stakeholders and community members and other service organizations is really important to have discussions and consultations along this point. I wanted to just briefly highlight how many interventions have been recognized in the sort of research and academic literature as being effective interventions in sort of reducing gaps in the care cascade. So this is by no means an exhaustive list of interventions along the cascade, but I just want to point out that it's not something that we don't need to start reinventing the wheel. Basically, there's a lot for us to work with, and the work really would come in adapting interventions that we know have worked in other contexts to our own local context. Finally, the last sphere of program science is the management, monitoring, and evaluation sphere. So it's really important to develop a useful program monitoring and evaluation plan right from the onset. So at this point, we identify outcomes that matter to the program and to program beneficiaries or primary users of programs. And we need to be open to revisit these outcomes over time as the program develops, as the epidemic changes over time. And monitoring should be happening regularly on an ongoing basis. And we always need to be mindful of whether our indicators that we've chosen in an evaluation framework are measuring what we want to measure. And if they're not, we need to think about how other indicators that we can use. Another important part of monitoring is process documentation. So when we're thinking about a large, complex public health program, it's important to keep track of decisions that are made along the way. So if we make changes in how we deliver services or changes in why we've selected another indicator to measure an output that we're interested in, we need to keep track of those changes so that we can understand whether they impact or sort of have an influence on how the program is achieving population level impact. And then evaluation is an iterative process, meaning it should happen not only at the end of a program, but throughout a program, so that we can use information from the evaluation to re-inform strategic planning and program implementation as a program moves through its sort of life course. Okay, and then we do it all over again. So this is, we could see in the previous, or in my sort of diagram that I showed, that this is a cycle, and really all of the knowledge and data that's coming out of monitoring and evaluation goes right back into informing how we can tweak the program to sort of ensure that it's remaining relevant and doing the right thing instead of sort of fizzling out and not allowing us to achieve the outcomes that we're interested in. So program science is sort of a never-ending, if we want to follow that framework, it's sort of a never-ending job, but ultimately it can result in a really effective and context-specific program. Okay, so that's it. Thanks so much, and just some acknowledgements. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Leigh. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our invited presenter, Dr. Alexandra King, who just moved to the big metropolis of Saskatoon, I understand, from BC, and has found time to attend our event today. Alexandra is from Nipissing First Nation in Ontario. She's the inaugural Cameco Chair in the Indigenous Health and Wellness and innovative position concerned with underlying health determinants, intersectionally and manifestations. Boy, that's a lot of big words. As an internal medicine specialist, she is ideally positioned to undertake the challenge using a two-eyed seeing approach using both Indigenous and Western healing approaches. Her particular clinical focus on HIV/AIDS, hepatitis C, and HIV/Hep C co-infections represents one critical health outcome consequent to colonialism. There are many others. She works in reconciliation, healing, wellness, and holistic care as determined by various levels, such as the individual, family, community, and nation. She is a principal investigator on various Canadian SEER research grants and related to Indigenous people and wellness in areas of drug use, HIV, Hep C, and co-infections. Other research interests include Indigenous wellness, more generally rural remote health services, peer navigation support, land-based cultural healing, and Indigenous research ethics. She serves on many local and national initiatives, including the Heart and Stroke Heart Failure Council, CAN Hep C, CTN Health for people who use drugs, Working Group Co-Lead, and Chirac. Alexandra will speak today about researching ourselves back to life and wellness.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. And like Leigh, I think I'm a little bit too short for this mic. So I wanted to talk about researching ourselves back to life and wellness. And this is actually coming from a quote from Marlene Brandt Castellano. And she was talking about back in 2004, if we have been researched to death, and a lot of Indigenous people will know the history of bad research that has been done. And so Marlene was saying that maybe it's time we start researching ourselves back to life. And so I really use this as one of my inspirations in terms of what I do and how I go about doing it. I would like to acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 1 territory. I'm a guest here, and it is with great gratitude and respect. And I also want to take and point out that I'm a guest now on Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, and that one really appreciates how lovely and small a community Saskatchewan is. Manitoba would be similar. And both my husband and I have been really quite welcome there, and we're quite grateful for that. The tragedy last week, I think, really helped hit home how small these communities really are, and it's something that we're all dealing with now there. In terms of disclosures, I have received speaker fees and grants from a variety of pharmaceutical companies. I have to say I did this prior to getting the chair, and this was one way that our group used to fund our research. So what I found was, particularly when I was starting our research projects, there wasn't a lot of money for elders, people with lived experience, and so on. And so this was one way that we were able to take and fund that aspect of our research. So I'm finding in this day and age, as we're seeing the public health pot shrinking, we're having to come up with some very new and innovative partnerships. As Indigenous people, we often take and introduce ourselves, who we are and where we're from. And I want to say how lovely it was to hear Ojibwe this morning. This is my maternal grandparents, Desmond, who is Algonquin from Temiskaming First Nation. He also spent a lot of his life in Mattawa. And then Mary, who is Ojibwe from Nipissing and also Mohawk from Oka. And the baby that is being held there is actually my mom. This was something that was written by the Jesuits at the time of contact with the Nipissing. They had been very impressed with my ancestors and said that the Nipissing, you know, if he weren't a free man and independent man, then there was no absolute freedom or independence on earth. So these are the footsteps in which I follow. I want to start with a little bit of history, and this slide is actually courtesy of Dr. Brenda Elias, who is a professor here in Manitoba and is a really great ally in research. And one of the things that I think we sort of have to point out again and again is that Canada was not conquered. We are a negotiated country, and that has always been the way. And so we start all the way back in the 1700s with very small treaties between the Europeans and typically the West Coast people. And subsequent to that, then the British Crown negotiated various treaties, then the Canadian government did. And one of the things that Brenda was doing here across the bottom is putting the different flags that have existed on these lands, since the time of contact. And so I think it's really important to be thinking about treaties and what treaties mean, and that, in fact, we are all treaty people. We all have treaty responsibilities. The Indian Act of 1876 has really taken and affected the lives of Indigenous people. It defines who we are and allows there to be the stratification, if you will, amongst Indigenous people. So we have things like status and non-status. We have First Nations and Métis. And the government was very successful in fracturing us and negotiating with us individually. And they took and created the Indian Act as a way of governing us and our lands. And through the Indian Act, then they enacted various policies such as gender discrimination, the residential schools, ban on religious ceremonies, and restrictions on higher education. And a lot of non-Indigenous people, I think, do not appreciate the impact that the Indian Act had on our lives. So as an example, until fairly recently, we were not allowed to go to university. So the highest education that we could get was actually normal school. And that meant then that we could become teachers or nurses, but that was about it. My husband, Malcolm King, is actually one of the first Indigenous PhDs in Canada, and that to me is really shocking that somebody walking in our midst in our lifetime has that honor. So, Thomas King, who is no relation either to my husband or myself, but has really written some interesting books. One of my favorites is The Inconvenient Indian. And in it, he says that instead of trying to kill the Indian to save the child, North America might have gone into partnership with various nations, and together they could have come up with an education plan that would have complemented Native cultures and perhaps even enriched white culture at the same time. Instead, North America decided that Native education had to be narrowly focused on white values, decided that Native values, ceremonies, and languages were inferior and had no place or value in contemporary curriculum. That was the first abuse of the residential school system, and that is something from which we are still recovering. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People tabled its report called the third volume called Gathering Strength, and in it they were talking about social conditions. They say that they had improved over the past 50 years leading up to 1996, but they do not come close to that of non-Aboriginal people. Life expectancy is lower. Illness is more common. Human problems from family violence to alcohol abuse are more common too. Fewer children graduate from high school. Fewer have gone on to colleges and universities. The homes of Aboriginal people are often more flimsy, leaky, and overcrowded. Water and sanitation systems in Aboriginal communities are often inadequate. Fewer Aboriginal people have jobs, spend more time in jails and prisons. And part of what they said in this report is that we do not want pity or handouts. We want recognition that these problems are largely the result of the loss of lands and resources, destructions of our economies and social institutions, and denial of our nationhood. We seek a range of remedies for these injustices, but most of all, we seek control of our lives. I thought this was really interesting because RCAP celebrated its 20th anniversary in November 2016. And when you think about things, there really hasn't been a lot that has changed in those 20 years. Almost all of the problems that they're highlighting here still exist, and in fact may have even gotten worse. And, you know, at the time of RCAP, there's a great deal of excitement amongst the Indigenous people. We were really thinking that there'd be changes that would happen. And we're now moving forward into the era of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What they decided was that they were not going to have recommendations. They had made them calls to action, and that was because they recognized that a lot of the recommendations out of RCAP went into a report and sat on the shelf. So what they wanted instead was action. They wanted solutions. And so that's why we had the calls to action in this report. There are 94 in total, and they cover a vast range of things. There are 7 that deal with health, and these are things that I am living with every day and trying to figure out how do we implement. They are my guide in how I approach research and my clinical work. But there's over half of them that have to do with reconciliation. And that is because to the commissioners, to the people who are part of the commission, they recognize the strong, strong need for reconciliation, and that was our only way forward. And when I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about the reconciliation that is needed between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. I'll go out to various TRC events, and often it's only Indigenous people in the room, and you know we can't get there by ourselves. The other thing, though, is that within First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, we also have a lot of healing that we have to be doing ourselves, and a lot of that goes back to that process of colonization and the fracturing and so on. So I mentioned about the health aspects of the TRC. Call to action number 18, acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health is a direct result of Canadian government policies, including residential schools. So that's going right back to what RCAP was saying and many other people have said before that. And so when I'm thinking about HIV or hepatitis C or drug use, these to me are in fact just end manifestations of colonization. And I think that if we approach it from that perspective, it then comes up with different kinds of solutions. Calls to action number 19, the setting measurable goals or targets and work collaboratively to achieve them with clear reporting. I am constantly watching the data that is coming out, be it HIV, be it Hep C, and so on. And the Indigenous data is really important within this for us to understand how big is the problem and whether or not we're making progress. And so I think it's really important that we're looking at what we are collecting and how we're collecting it and doing so consistently, because this is ultimately going to be providing justification for people to be applying for programming and research dollars. And so without knowing how big the problem is, we can't then be really making it towards a solution. And the third one that I just am highlighting right now is recognizing the value of Aboriginal healing practices and using them in the treatment of Aboriginal patients in collaboration with Aboriginal healers and elders. I also apply this to my research. So, you know, when I'm looking at how it is that we're going about research, I think it is also really important then that we're bringing in these healing practices and ways of knowing and so on into our research that we're undertaking. Complex lived realities of Indigenous peoples. So this is a map of Canada with the 2016 data. And in 2016, 4.9% of the population self-identified as Indigenous. You can see that as we go from east to west, there are fewer Indigenous people in the Maritimes, which was where we first had contact. As we come in through the prairies, Manitoba and Saskatchewan actually have the highest percentage, unless you're talking about the north, where the numbers of people are much smaller, but a significantly greater number of them are Indigenous. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the census, and here's this geeky numbers thing again coming out, but the expectation was that we would go to about 4.6% of the population. So in 2011, we were 4.3%. And then when you're looking at the natural growth rate within a population, the expectation was that it was going to be about 4.6. We came to 4.9, and you would think 0.3% isn't significant, but it actually is. So there was this questioning as to why did we go to 4.9. And it's really interesting because out east, there's a lot of people who have suddenly chosen to self-identify. And some of these people are in their 40s and 50s and 60s. And so what that is almost, I think, talking about is the change in the overall climate here in Canada, that perhaps now it is more acceptable for us to be Indigenous, for us to say, I'm Métis or I am First Nation, and maybe do it for the first time in our life when we're in our 40s or 50s or 60s. The other thing, though, that I found interesting is that the growth rate here in the prairies, so Manitoba, sorry, I'm calling Manitoba prairies, which I guess really isn't technically correct, but Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, we really didn't see significant jumps in the number of people self-reporting as Indigenous. I'm more familiar right now with the current context within Saskatchewan, but when we have things like the Boushie trial and so on, I don't think it's all that surprising that we're not seeing this sudden flourishing and reawakening of people wanting to identify as Indigenous. So I think we have a lot of work that we have to do here. The other thing that, I guess we have, whoops, there we go. The other thing that I wanted to talk about quickly, because I was looking at the census data for northern Manitoba, as well as I'm familiar with that of northern Saskatchewan. In your far north, your percentage of Indigenous people go way up. It's greater than 75, greater than 80%, and I see she's nodding, so. And we have the same thing in Saskatchewan. These are numbers that are approaching what you see in the territories, in particular Nunavut. And so it's really important to be thinking about then the significant differences in what that would mean to that area and programming and services and so on up in the far north. The other thing is that in Winnipeg, Regina, and Saskatoon, we have very strong urban Indigenous populations, and they have very unique needs. And so, again, just thinking about the particular context in which we're working, and I think it's really then will help us to refocus our energies and how we're approaching things. Back in 2009, Malcolm King and I, as well as Michael Gracie, who is a non-Indigenous Australian pediatric gastroenterologist, wrote this paper in The Lancet. Now, what was interesting is that Malcolm, at that point in time, we weren't yet married, he was telling me that he was writing this paper with Michael, and it was for The Lancet, and it was supposed to be a global exploration of Indigenous health. They ended up really focusing on what we call the Kansas nations, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. And it really was a deficit approach. So they were talking about, how Indigenous people have higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of, all of this badness. And Malcolm and I were talking about how we thought that wasn't the article that needed to be written. That instead for us, rather than focusing on all these deficits and all this badness, what we really needed to be doing is looking at what were the underlying causes. He went back to The Lancet and said that he thought we needed to expand the article a little bit to include this analysis of the underlying causes. And the Lancet originally said no. They said that the article was already too long and they couldn't see expanding it. But they came back and they said that actually they reconsidered and they thought that the argument that we made was so valid, they wanted to do a second article. And so that was why it was part 2. What's really interesting is that when we're reading different publications and so on, the number of people who will attribute what's in part 2 to part 1, not realizing that there were 2 articles. But in any case, so this was what came out back in 2009, and that was just when I was finishing medical school. And some of the critical messages within this article were about self-determination, again, going back to RCAP, going back to TRC. And we're talking about self-determination at the individual, the family, the community, and nation levels. connections with the land, culture, and language. And this was lost through colonization, residential schools, and the foster care system. And saying lost almost makes it sound accidental, but in fact, these were deliberate policies with this as intended outcome. And what we're seeing is that it's being regained through resilient action as well as reconciliation, and the incredible wisdom of our ancestors who managed to keep this alive, sometimes putting it to sleep, but kept so much alive for future generations. And the last thing that this article was talking about, though, was indigeneity as a health determinant. And this is by and large arising from the work of Professor Sir Mason Dury, who is a Maori psychiatrist. We got to spend some time with him in February this year, and this gentleman is approaching 80, and he is just so brilliant. In Aotearoa, or New Zealand, they call him Machua, meaning grandfather. So he was talking about identity, and that being Indigenous should not be a health risk. That, in fact, he saw this as being something very positive. These are the oldest cultures in the world. They're strong, they're vibrant, they're adaptable. And that, if we were to take and ground ourselves in our culture, our language, our tradition, self-determination, and so on, he saw this as our way forward. And it was based on the work of Sir Mason that I think really made me realize when I was in medical school, they would have things like diabetes and risk factors. It would say being Indigenous. Being Indigenous is not the risk factor for diabetes. It was being Indigenous that made us a target of colonization, which in fact is a risk factor. And if you look back, as an example, in diabetes, in work that was done in TB at the turn of the century, this would have been the 19th century, they were drawing blood samples for people looking at TB. And at that point in time, there was one case of diabetes that was seen in the Indigenous population. So I think that was about 1920, 1930. So you think about how bad diabetes has become. That is not part of our history. That is now part of our current reality, right? And similar things with HIV and so on. So again, I think the need to be looking at indigeneity as a positive identity as our way forward is really quite critical, and not seeing it as something as a deficit. Again, and this is similar to what I was showing in the RCAP report about Indigenous health inequities. And, there's this list here that I'm sure almost all of us are familiar with. I was speaking with an American scholar, and one of the things that she asked her class to do is to think about living life with one of these problems, let's say water quality issue. I don't know if any of you have ever lived in a boil water advisory, or having to truck in, bottles of water and so on. But it can make life really challenging. But if you think about Indigenous people, a lot of them are actually dealing with multiple of these issues at the same time. And so poor housing, as well as the lack of good water, as well as unemployment and so on. And that makes life really, really challenging. The other aspect, though, that I find is that we are all, again, continuing to focus on the deficits. And when you think about the flip side of the coin, I think we also have to be upholding the strength, the resilience, self-determination, holistic understandings of health and wellness, ecosystem approach. Indigenous people almost inherently think about the interrelationships and interconnections and our custodial role. And so, when we're looking at what is happening with the environment now, and how that impacts our health, but also our responsibilities towards then future generations and the environments to come. And so I think that these are, really important values as well. And so one of the things that I talk a lot about and focus a lot on is intersectionality. And I deliberately use the term intersectionality rather than syndemics, because intersectionality is a theory, a body of approach, I guess, that connects these various things together, whereas when you're looking at syndemics, that's focused on infectious diseases and things that happen together. And so therefore they're looking at HIV and Hep C, but they're looking at this from an infectious disease perspective. So, you know, with Hep C, we now have this fabulous cure. Great, we can get rid of it. With HIV, we've got these wonderful ARVs, which we can take and then suppress the virus, right? So that's the focus, and that's the intended outcome. As opposed to if you're looking at intersectionality, then we might be looking at unemployment or education, and that's where we're going to be focusing. And these tend to be way upstream things, the interventions, which therefore will allow not only HIV or Hep C or drug use, but maybe also diabetes and some of these other things to be impacted, right? And so I like the intersectionality as a framework. And so I start with something like indigeneity, and you can add in gender. And amongst many First Nations, Inuit, Métis people, but also other Indigenous cultures throughout the world, gender is a more nuanced and complex understanding than a dichotomy that has tended to come out of the European approach. And therefore, being, let's say, Métis and a woman could have very different implications than being Nipissing First Nation and a man or some such thing. Poverty, residential school experience, and I would say that this is within the family and within the community. For a lot of Indigenous communities, we have children at the center, and then you'll see that the family surrounds that child. When we take the child out of the center, it has left a huge hole in that community. And so therefore, for many First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, even if they don't have residential schools in their direct family history, they probably were affected by it because it affected their community or, you know, people around them. The other thing, sorry, is that the intergenerational effects of residential school are massive, and I think, you know, we're starting to understand that. And then you look at the 60 scoop, and you look right now at the number of children in care. There are more children in care now than there ever were in residential schools. So you think about the impact of that on future generations, and we've got a lot of work that we have to be doing. Trauma, and again, when I'm thinking about trauma, I'm looking at this from an Indigenous perspective. And so a lot of times when I'm talking with my patients, and these in particular might be people who are living, let's say, downtown East Side or something, I'm overwhelmed by the amount of trauma that they'll describe in their life. And we're talking about, you know, chronic, it is recurrent, it is repeated, it can be intimate, it could be stranger. But from an Indigenous perspective, we're also talking about trauma as an intergenerational thing. We're talking about trauma on the land and the environment and so on. And so I think that when you're thinking about trauma, you need to be looking at it from a very holistic perspective. Addiction, and so on. And so, you know, when we're talking about intersectionality, you're thinking about how these things weave together. And there aren't going to be silver bullets for solutions, right? These are complex problems, and you can't just go in and fix one petal or one area. Instead, you're needing to be looking at how do we deal with these things in their entirety. The other thing that I find is that a lot of people, even when they're thinking about all of these different problems and how they intersect and so on for a given person, they often think about this almost like it's a daisy, you know, so it's a nice flat flower where everything is just sort of added together. But the reality is that there are these interactions between these different things. And so instead, I think you have to be thinking more like a dahlia or, you know, one of these big and poofy flowers, because these things are very complicated. There are levels and layers and so on. And as you start working through them, you begin to appreciate how interdependent the different things are. I was asked to talk quickly about research approaches, and I was really glad that Leigh mentioned program science. I actually have that as one of the things I'm going to be talking about this afternoon as I expand upon things. But I did want to take and talk about two-eyed seeing, and this is a concept that was put forward by Albert Marshall, who's Mi'kmaq, and he talks about seeing with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing through one eye, the strengths of Western ways of knowing through another, and then the importance of using both those eyes together. So in terms of HIV research, I like to think about this as, let's say, these ARVs. So we have these fabulous new medications that have come out. They are really powerful. They still, some of them still have some side effects, but mostly they're very well tolerated, right? And it means that if you start on these medications and take them regularly, that you will have near normal life expectancy. You can live healthily and well with HIV. That's very different from where we came from, right? But for most people who have HIV, they will tell you that the healing that they need is much more than what they're getting in those little pills, right? And so that's where the Indigenous ways of knowing then come in. And so, it's not just like this pan-Aboriginal concept. I'm Nipissing, I have Ojibwe, Mohawk, and Algonquin. That's where I'm going to be turning to really begin to understand my Indigenous ways of knowing, right? And it is that sort of approach to holistic healing and health and well-being that for me then I would see as blending with the Western medication and would allow me then to be achieving health and wellness, right? And so I think the two-eyed seeing approach is really important from a clinical perspective. I think from a research perspective, it is also critically important. So we, as part of our research team, have elders, and these are not elders who will open and close or advise or, periodically. They're in the trenches with us. They're actually undertaking the research with us. They're helping us to figure out what are the areas of research, what are the questions that are important, and so on. We also have people with lived experience. So that, again, is another eye, if you will, who are bringing in their wisdom and, again, helping us to prioritize, helping us to determine what the questions are, how we're going to be undertaking the research, how we're analyzing it, and so on. So, it's bringing in the academic eye and then other eyes as well. And so I think that if you're seeing things from a two-eyed seeing approach, you can get a lot of strength. The other concept that I want to talk about is that has been put forward by Willie Ermine, who is a really brilliant scholar, philosopher, and he's also a lodge keeper in Saskatchewan. And he talks about ethical space. And so he's talking about when you're bringing two different worldviews together. And in this case, we're looking at Western and Indigenous worldviews, but it could instead be, let's say, chemistry and physics, like two different worldviews together. You need to be creating this space where we can come together and talk to each other. We have to develop a vocabulary that we can then be able to relate to each other. And as Indigenous people, when we're creating these spaces, we actually see this as something sacred. It is building a relationship that then will allow us to be working together. The other part of ethical space that I think is really relevant for Indigenous people is that we have to level the playing field. And so the current reality is that we privilege Western ways of knowing. So in fact, it is above Indigenous ways of knowing. And you'll see this in, how I'm Dr. King and, people have their PhDs or doctors or professors and so on. I mean, our elders do not have that sort of recognition, and we're not uplifting their ways of knowing and so on. And so when we're coming together, I think it is really critical that we're thinking about how is it that we uplift, how do we privilege Indigenous ways of knowing so that they're coming in on equal footing, and then we can really be considering the impact of each and the strengths of each in a good way and create that ethical space. So sorry, I know that I'm almost through my time, so I just wanted to talk, I believe this is my last slide, about approaches to research and how we're looking at things, and I'm going to go into more detail on this afternoon. But what one often will see in different graphs and so on is that you start with something like residential schools or whatever, and then you'll see sort of different things that happen, and then you end up with badness at the end. And, you know, I'm thinking about the work of, let's say, Yin Paradies, who's an Australian Indigenous scholar, and he starts with racism and ends up with a variety of end manifestations. And so, you know, we start with colonization, and it can be things like the Indian Act, residential schools, whatever. And this ends up creating within ourselves biological reactions, and that in turn creates emotional responses, spiritual wounds, and also physical responses. And, you know, you end up into this area where you're doing negative coping, trying to deal with what all has happened, and that could include drug use, alcohol, other ways of escaping, but also different pathologies, early stage pathologies, such as, let's say, metabolic syndrome. And eventually then you end up at the far end, which is things like addictions and suicide, or HIV or diabetes and so on. And so these are sort of these end manifestations of colonization, which is what the TRC is was talking about. But if you look along the upper part, that to me is where the solutions are, and that's where people are either pulling themselves out of these cycles, or where we could help to intervene and create interventions. And so some of these will be involving, let's say, pharmaceuticals or Western counseling, but a lot of them will also involve things like land-based healing, culture-based healing. And when we're out here, we really are looking almost at recovery interventions. But if, in fact, we could implement things further upstream, let's say with our youth and so on, then we would be looking at more of the primary prevention, health promotion kind of stuff. And so the connection with land and culture becomes really critically important, supporting positive identity, achieving, maintaining holistic wellness. But that still isn't enough, and we have to go even further upstream, and that's where we're getting into these societal interventions that will actually get at the underlying health determinants, reconciliation, helping us reset the relationship, and so on. And if, in fact, we could be working up in that space, then I think you would see a completely different trajectory, and it would not only be for Indigenous people, but for all of us. This Tetra pitch was published, was something we included in our article in The Lancet, and it really means a lot to me at the time and now. And it's basically what somebody included as part of their PhD thesis. That was a student working with Malcolm. And she starts off in the top left corner, talking about the history that as Indigenous people, we were living in harmony with the environment, with ourselves. There was wellness. And then when we go down to the bottom corner on the left side, you're seeing the impact of colonization, urbanization. And the Indigenous person, the woman in the bottom, she might be seen as dead, but I see her as sleeping. That's our culture. And then as we move into the top right corner, you're seeing the reawakening of Indigenous culture, of spirituality, of ceremony. And finally, in this bottom right corner, we're achieving a new sense of wellness. So we're not going back to what was. We recognize that we would have changed and evolved. Culture is dynamic, but it would include the best of the Western world as well as Indigenous ways of knowing, and so we'd end up in a much better, different spot. That's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to introduce Jackie Gahagan. I think I said that right. I hope I did. She has come all the way from Nova Scotia and is here today to talk about exciting research studies she is working on. Jackie is a professor of health promotion and is passionate about health equity issues, including access to testing innovation. I will let her tell you more about herself, a sea of HIV point-of-care pilot studies, and moving beyond piloting preliminary findings.
Bonjour tout le monde. How's everybody doing? Good? Do you need to get up and stretch or something? Get up and walk around your table or something? Okay, I'll take that as a no, but please do feel free to get up and move around as you see fit. As you mentioned, I am Jackie Gahagan. I'm a professor of health promotion from Dalhousie University in lovely Halifax, Nova Scotia. It's my pleasure to be here, but before I get started, I'd like to just thank Dr. King for an incredible presentation. I haven't had the benefit of hearing you speak other than at the CAR conference, so that was really lovely to hear your thoughts, so thank you very much for that. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We are all treaty people. I would also like to acknowledge our funder, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and our national partners for this grant support and the important implications this has, I would argue, for health equity. And from my perspective, the issue of access to testing is a health equity issue, and it's of national concern. This is particularly concerning in areas in more rural and remote parts of the country. We're a huge pile of geography. We are complex, getting from one end of the country to the other. Getting here yesterday from Halifax seems like it would be a straightforward thing, but no. It is never that straightforward with Air Canada, for example. So my flight leaving Halifax was delayed, which meant my connecting flight in Toronto, I wouldn't get here until like sometime this morning. So I had to get rerouted through Ottawa. So again, just speaking to geography and the importance of remembering coast to coast, it's not that straightforward to get access to things, basic health services, including things such as testing. So that's sort of the impetus for this project that I'm going to walk you through. Just some of the preliminary findings. We're not done yet. We still have lots of work to do this summer. Thank you to Laurie and Mike, and thank you to Geneviève from NCCID. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here, so thank you to both of you, Laurie and Mike. This is an important event. I think it's got lots of potential in terms of sharing lessons learned and how we can actually learn from each other. And so I have a little bit of a challenge for those of you in the room. Francisco Ibanez Carrasco, my colleague over there, is going to come up in a moment or two and talk a little bit about the importance of knowledge translation and exchange. So this afternoon, Francisco and I will be co-hosting a couple of focus groups, and those focus groups are actually meant to get your thoughts on how we can mobilize HIV point-of-care testing across Canada differently, maybe in a better way. And so your thoughts and your experiences in terms of how you have seen HIV point-of-care testing happen in your region or not would be good to hear from you. So each of those focus groups can take up to a maximum of 10 people, and Francisco is doing this on a first-come, first-served basis. So if you do want to come to either of those focus groups this afternoon, please let Francisco and I know. There's a consent process that we need to go through in order to invite you to that discussion. The focus groups will be anonymized, which is to say if you mention the name of a person, thing, place, or something identifiable, that information will be removed, because what we're really looking at is how we can sort of mobilize for change around HIV point-of-care testing in Canada. Okay, so just a little bit of backgrounder. People here are familiar with REACH 2.0? Mitts in the air if you know. Okay, so there's a number of you who know REACH 2.0. Francisco Ibanez Carrasco is the long-standing brain trust behind that, particularly the Universities Without Walls. Anybody here part of Universities Without Walls? Yep, so we've got at least one. Awesome. So the moving beyond piloting, they're everywhere though, Francisco, aren't they? Your students. Moving beyond piloting is part of a larger program of research that's connected with the CIHR Center for REACH, REACH 2.0 as we affectionately refer to it. REACH 2.0, for those who don't know, is a national partnership among people living with HIV, community-based organizations, frontline service providers, health research folks from across the country, including 25 academic institutions, federal, provincial, and regional policymakers. The mission of REACH 2.0 is to undertake and foster interdisciplinary research and teaching to understand the factors driving HIV, and I would argue other STBBIs, and find innovative solutions to move research evidence into action. And I really like the presentation on what's the difference between implementation science and program science, which is a question that my students ask all the time. And I mean this in a nice way, but they liken it to program evaluation on speed or something. So it's kind of taking program evaluation, that sort of cycle of what's the issue, how do you address it, how do you take the lessons learned and cycle it back in. So I'd like to have a chat with you over lunch, but no pressure on that. Okay, so why does HIV point of care testing matter? And I know most of you in this room will know this already, but just so we have a shared sort of baseline understanding of where we're going with this presentation, depending on who you ask, there are up to a quarter of Canadians who are HIV positive and unaware of their status. We know that HIV point of care testing can allow for testing outside clinical settings. So again, to my earlier point about more rural and remote areas or individuals who may not have a family physician, I think thinking about testing innovation like POCT makes sense. We also know that HIV POCT has been well utilized nationally and internationally to help address the United Nations 90-90-90, and everybody in this room, I'm assuming, is familiar with that. People need to get tested in order to know their status, in order to get them into treatment, care, et cetera, and virally suppress. So it's a really important first part of that UNAIDS targets. POCT can also help reduce barriers to more traditional testing, and again, particularly in less well-resourced areas. We've just had accepted a paper that's being published this month on HIV POCT in non-urban centers. If you want more information about that paper, I can certainly share that with you. And POCT may also assist in linkages to care and treatment, which is really important for those folks who have a reactive test. This is what the packet looks like. Some of you have probably already seen this. We've had the good fortune of working with Rick Galley from INSTI, from Biolytical rather, and we were able to bring some of these test kits to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and work with the Mainline Needle Exchange, the Low Threshold Methadone Program, and the Native Friendship Center to provide this testing opportunity to individuals. And what we heard was, that's great, love the technology, but can you please tell me whether or not I have hepatitis C? So that leads to the question of, can we do more with this kind of technology and look at the possibility of multiplex. I'm gonna try this and see how we go. This is meant to be a little video that maybe some of you have not seen before.
I'm going to show you how to create a stunning professional website.
That's
Wix.
totally not it.
Welcome to the first ever nacho spot. What I love about Wix is you can change anything you want.
Huh? Go back. Sorry, I can't hear you over that. What am I doing? Oh, skip the ad, sorry. Oh my God, so we've missed some of Rick Galley.
First of all, it really facilitates the testing
That's okay.
experience for individuals coming forward for testing in remote settings. So access to testing is simplified and less complex than traditional models. And it also makes the testing process very simple for test providers who often have to face large numbers of people coming forward for testing at one time. Our test currently is in use in about 59 countries worldwide, including North America, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. The test contains everything that's required to conduct the test on a subject. The alcohol swab for cleaning the finger at the puncture area, a single-use safety lancet to do the finger stick with, a capillary action pipette to collect the sample, the reagents required to do the test, and the membrane cassette where the test is conducted into. So briefly, after the blood is collected, it's added to solution 1, mixed gently, poured into the membrane unit, allowed to flow through for a few seconds, followed by solution 2, which is your color indicator. That also then is poured in and flows through in a few seconds. The last step is to add the clarifying reagent, and the results are then ready for interpretation, all within 60 seconds.
Oops. So what you should note about that video is Rick Galley was doing it in a clinical setting, which I find, does anybody else find that a little ironic, or is it just me? Okay. So it's just me then. All right, fine. So what's interesting about that is the use of INSTI in non-clinical settings has a great promise. And one of the pushbacks that we've heard is around sensitivity and specificity of the test. And so I'm just putting this slide up to give you a sense of how accurate this particular testing innovation is. And in fact, it's used, with the U.S. military. It's used all over the world in a variety of, I would argue, fairly difficult settings, right? And still has good sensitivity and specificity. Now, what I'm really interested in is this notion of multiplex testing. So I am going to talk to you about what we're doing with our HIV POCT, but I just want you to bracket off a moment in time and think about the possibilities around multiplex testing. So I'll give you an example. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, we had an outbreak among men who have sex with men around HIV and syphilis. And so what the public health folks were saying is maybe we need to do a social marketing campaign to increase awareness about the fact that syphilis is a bacterial infection, and it's, is this being recorded? So I probably don't want to say the word junk, do I? So hand on junk. Anyway, so you know where I'm going with that. So it's a bacterial infection. So it doesn't mean that it has to be blood to blood to transmit, is where I'm going with that. And so even in terms of people's awareness about how chlamydia can be contracted, there was some dearth of information in circulation. So the idea was to give men who have sex with men and other folks information about syphilis. And what we found is people didn't print out the check, the requisition to go get tested for syphilis in any great number, right? So there's something in there that we still need to figure out. And I think testing innovation such as multiplex does give us some promise in terms of getting ahead of the burden of STBBIs in Canada. So my hope is that although this says made in Canada, you can see that on the top of the packet, it's not available for use in Canada and it hasn't been approved by Health Canada yet. So just something to think about in terms of actions. Okay, so back to our previously scheduled program on the Moving Beyond piloting project. Essentially what we're interested in doing here was to look at the social ecological barriers and facilitators to scaling up HIV point-of-care testing. You might ask why. I'll tell you one reason why is that we have lots of pilot tests but not a whole lot of sustainable projects. And so I'm from the Atlantic region. We have 4 provinces, none of which have access to this testing innovation. So again, from a health equity perspective, I'm just putting the question out there, can we do better? Can we do things differently? And I would say, yes, we can. So what we proposed to do was look at those social ecological factors that create barriers or facilitators to scaling up of HIV POCT pilots. So we really wanted to know what were the number of pilot projects completed since 2005, which was the year that Health Canada approved INSTI. We wanted to look at the numbers that were scaled up and became sustainable programs in Canada. And as I said, we're not done with the data analysis, but to give you a sense of what we're trying to do, we used a participatory approach to spatial mapping. We mobilized the findings through knowledge synthesis, which is one of the things that we're doing here. And what we want to do is develop a better understanding of the current social ecological factors and use that to understand what's happening in provinces and regions, which is why we're inviting folks who are here today to come and join Francisco and I for one of the 2 focus groups this afternoon. And also one of the outcomes from this little pilot study is to develop a larger operating grant looking at issues of POCT. So looking at where are those successful examples of scaling up and how can we do that, particularly in regions that don't have good coverage. So the methods then are essentially threefold. They're interconnected and iterative. They involve collecting and analyzing data from program documents, both gray literature and academic literature. We also had data from Biolytical in relation to where the test kits were offered between 2005 and 2016. and then we're conducting a series of focus groups, workshops, and developing short reports, and Francisco will come up and talk a little bit more about the knowledge translation components of this project. And I apologize for this. We have a fresh version of this that is a little bit easier to read, but this was meant to give you kind of a snapshot of where we see the test kits in Canada. And you can see they cluster around Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, which isn't a big surprise. We do have a new version of this that's been retooled to be both more readable and also to give a little bit more detail in terms of outerlying areas, because one of the concerns we have is what happens in more rural and remote areas that don't have access to Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver Central. So we also looked at the distribution of test kits relative to diagnosis rate. So you can sort of see this by province and territory. Again, you can see the Atlantic region does not have test kits, so there's no line there in terms of distribution of the kits. This is a poster that we're putting together for CAR, which is basically just trying to take this complex pestle analysis. Are people familiar with pestle analysis? It's super fun. Should Google search it. Do a little pestle analysis over your lunch break. So it looks at political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal issues that actually create context whereby HIV POCT happens or doesn't happen. And so this is part of what we asked people in an online survey. We sent this out through Opinio, which is the platform that my university supports, and we invited people across the country to tell us what they thought were the factors that contributed to their HIV POCT. So we had 184 surveys completed or partially completed, which meant you had to go into the Opinio survey and click agree to participate in order for the questions to pop up. And some people finished all of the questions and some people did not, but we had 184 people consent to dive into the online survey. So one of the questions that we wanted to get more information about is what's the kind of setting that your HIV POCT took place, and 32% reported community settings, 30% reported clinical settings, 8% reported hospitals, 19% reported outreach settings, and the remainder were a series of other settings. And we also asked, has your program been evaluated? Because we know this is kind of a big ticket item for lots of funders, is tell us what you did with the money and was it successful? And so we actually asked this question in a couple of ways, but overall 63% reported yes, that their pilot program had been evaluated, 17% reported no, and 20% reported that they didn't know if an evaluation took place. So we asked further for more specificity on the type of evaluation, and we wanted to know about two key things that can either, in the literature, can make or break the success of an intervention. One is acceptability, so in other words, what are the perceptions among stakeholders that the project was satisfactory, so does it meet the standards of the community for acceptability? And then we also asked about feasibility. In other words, did was the project able to be carried out as planned? And you can see the numbers there. For acceptability, 69% reported yes, 6% reported no, and 25% did not know. And in terms of feasibility, we asked, specifically, did a feasibility evaluation take place? 67% reported yes, 8% said no, and the remaining 25% didn't know. And then we also asked people, at the end of the closed-ended questions, we also gave people an opportunity to add other information, open-ended text boxes, right? And so in the open-ended text boxes, we said, well, if there are other types of evaluation, what were they? And this is kind of what we heard. End of grant, impact, numbers of tests completed, unsure, linkages to care. And so my takeaway message from this is we need greater conceptual and design clarity on evaluation. So I think we all agree that evaluation in some form or other is important to determine whether or not what we thought we set out to do, we actually achieved it. I think having some sense of clarity on evaluations with respect to this particular innovation would be helpful for scaling up. We also asked about what was the target population that your POCT pilot focused on, and you can see the breakdown here. Primarily gay men or men who have sex with men, injection drug users, street-involved or homeless populations, Indigenous populations, women, trans people, youth, African Caribbean, Black communities, and other communities. So that's kind of the breakdown, which I don't think should be a big surprise to anybody. That kind of follows the flow of some of the epi-surveillance data that's out there. Now here's where it starts to get really interesting. So we asked about continuation of HIV POCT after the pilot phase, and 55% reported yes, 32% reported no, and 13% reported not knowing whether or not their pilot became a sustainable or continuing HIV testing program. And some of the open-ended responses we got to, what were just off the top of your head, what were sort of the key issues that you think contributed to the continuation? And we heard things such as political will, government support, strong MOH support and funding, leadership, and ongoing funding. So none of those are probably a surprise to anybody in this room. But we did use the PESTEL analytic framework to look more closely at some of the open-ended responses that are looking at the political considerations around scaling up POCT, economic issues, social issues, technological issues, and environmental and legal. And we also asked people to consider other factors that might be involved in scaling up of HIV POCT in their particular region. And this is just a very rudimentary sort of analysis that we looked at. The vast majority of people spoke to political and economic issues, which again, I don't think is that surprising. What I did find surprising was the technological bit wasn't as high. I thought it would be higher than that, but that's okay. And then there's also a lot of concern around criminalization of non-disclosure, right? So I also thought that legal would be higher. So in other words, if getting tested and knowing your status can be seen as a disincentive because of this other notion of criminalization for non-disclosure, I had assumed that would be higher, but I was proven wrong. In terms of next steps, and this is where Francisco Ibanez Carrasco can come to the mic, please. Thank you. So Francisco, for those of you who don't know, is the whiz kid in knowledge translation and exchange. And so part of the involvement of Francisco and his crew from OHT and now St. Mike's is to provide some of the KTE steps. So I'm going to turn it over to Francisco for the rest. Thank you.
Hey, how are you doing? You might be wondering, I have lots of friends here. I've been coming to Winnipeg as a happy settler for a long time, for 15 years, and they used to bring me to entertain and herd the cats when the Manitoba AIDS Coalition used to exist. I'm that old, and so you might be wondering, here we go. You might be wondering why an old man who's lived with HIV for 33 years would be interested at all in testing, because I'm like so beyond the test, right? But I tell you why, and of course people always, I'm aware that it's being filmed, but hey, so here's some TMI for you. Some of you might decide not to take, but I did say this in the focus group in Toronto, and it's a real reason. So I'm not only old, but I'm also a little bit of a pervert or pig or whatever you want to call it. And I happen to have a boyfriend who's 35 years old and who is HIV negative. Compute. Okay, you're there. You got there. Yep. No, I'm not a sugar daddy. I'm just, it's happened. It happens to a lot of people, and because it happens to a lot of people of all kinds of colors. My boyfriend happens to be of a different. He's not Latino like I am, and of a different color and ethno-racialized background. We want to make sure that everybody is safe and everybody's having the love life and the sexual life that they want. And this is the point of, one of the points, I know that Jackie said this much more eloquently and professionally, but this is the point, is bringing, the certainty to different kinds of people so they can be together. This is why POCT is a very important, if not the only one, kinds of tests that exist. And it's kind of amazing that we're getting those kinds of results at this point in 2018.
So I hope that paints a picture for you about your cousin, your neighbor who's a slut, or your, your manager who is a little bit against that for moral reasons and all that, right? And so put all that in context, please. And that's my mission. That's what I do. I put things in context in the street. So one of the things that we intend to do with all this information, and this is why we invite you, third time sells the book. This is why we're inviting you to the 2 focus groups this afternoon. We're gonna be there, we're gonna make it fun for you. Focus groups are not only places where we pick out of your brain, but we also provide information, that thing, garbage in, garbage out. So we don't provide you garbage. We provide you good information, so you give us good ideas that are feasible feasible and acceptable, as Jack has mentioned, in your locale, in your health services, in your various cultural groups. So please come to that and listen to what we have to say and give us, just vent out. We're happy. We brought a fan just in case things hit. Very important. I travel with those to do my hair. So the next steps are that we're very interested in organizing a more concerted project and through CIHR. I just heard in the room, there's nothing like coming to Winnipeg. I love it. There's always a buzz somewhere else, and I have my ear to the ground. I'm working here on different projects I'm not going to tell you about because it'll confuse you terribly, but I have amazing friends who are peer researchers who are the most important KTE, knowledge transfer and exchange people you can imagine. These are the people who actually walk down the street and, like us, we're just some sort of Olympus in the academia. Yikes. So we're trying to organize an operating grant really to figure out the importance and what are the barriers and facilitators in a more systematic way across the country on POCT. We have a presentation coming at the Canadian Association of HIV Research, which unfortunately is the only, unlike this amazing, more local events, is the only conference we have on HIV, because we know we're getting old and but it's kind of crazy that's the only place we have, isn't it, Alex? Yes, it is crazy, because we should have. We have an amazing Indigenous conference, but it's not every year, right? So, and they do work really hard on that. So we're going to that. If you're there, come and visit us. And what is that? What else are we trying to do? Oh yeah, we're good. CPHA acronyms. Canadian Public Health Association. Thank you. See, I'm nothing without Jackie. Nothing. And so we're going to be there. These are all important steps, because one of the most important things to do, not only for you folks, for the powers that are above us or below us, is to socialize the idea. If people don't hear enough about, how program science work, although I'm not a program scientist. I'm a community-based research scientist. That's why I talk like this. But if you don't hear about these things, you don't get the idea, okay, this is something that is missing, it's something that is visible, it's something that my niece needs, it's something that my aunt should, although she's like in her 60s, but she seems to be getting it on. And why is it, I don't have an aunt, but I'm sure you have an aunt somewhere who's like doing drugs, the terrible cannabis, and she's having sex, and she should go to the POCT. And maybe it's not, you do. I can see, you do. We won't talk about her. But this is the reasons, these are the real reasons we need these people, to be, to have this accessible, to be welcomed in these places. So there's all that work to do, and hopefully we'll contribute to that. Anything else, Dr. Gahagan? And come to otherwise we're going to cry. We'll cry. Oh, that's it. That's good.
Okay, and just, Geneviève, can I just say something about the Canadian Public Health Association thing? Okay, so thank you, Francisco.
You're very welcome.
So we are doing another, part 2 of what we did in Halifax at the Canadian Public Health Association, which is about testing. And so we're kind of doing a refresh of that, but with new innovation. And we actually have, so the dude you saw in the video, Rick Galley. So Rick Galley is going to come and speak and talk a little bit about the sort of challenges with getting approvals for multiplex testing in Canada. So the test kits are made here, but they're used elsewhere in the world. And I think CPHA will be a great forum to sort of further that actions around testing. And the other piece is around, help me out here, Geneviève. The other one is CPHA. Right. So Public Health Agency of Canada, how could I forget, is also developing a document called Actions on STBBIs. And for those of you who were at the meeting a year ago, February, and then the more recent one, you were at that meeting. Anyway, so there's a few people in this room I know that were at that meeting. And so here's the challenge. Picture this. And this is a challenge for everybody in this room. I dare you. So Public Health Agency of Canada has shifted away from HIV as a standalone issue, let's just say, and have moved to the integration of STBBI. So that's the model. And so that creates opportunities, but it also creates complexities around how you move the testing component forward when there is an approval process that is somewhat antithetical to getting new testing innovation out to populations that can benefit from it. So if we look at the example in the UK, and I spent a lot of time in Scotland, and when they rolled out PrEP, they rolled out access to home test kits. So you could go into the Boots drugstore and get your test kit. And if you're in a serodiscordant couple, and Francisco likes to overshare, so you heard that example of what do you do if you don't have access to testing and you're in a new relationship, and if you are determining whether or not PrEP is something that is a tool that you want to use, having access to sort of low threshold opportunities for testing kind of makes sense. So the UK, I think, is a nice example of how they've taken those actions and mobilized it into, does anybody know where the Shetlands are? Okay, so like the Shetlands are, let's just call them super remote, and even the MOHs in the Shetlands were on the phone with us while we're sitting in Glasgow saying, yes, we're all on board. We're all going to make this happen. And no one wants to read in the Scottish Times on Monday morning that people came into a clinic in the Shetlands, not to pick on the Shetlands, but just as an example, and we're told we have no access to PrEP and we have no access to point-of-care testing. So really, I think we all in this room need to be our own action figures in making this happen, and I think that creates a little bit more of an opportunity to work in partnership with the Public Health Agency of Canada, Canadian Public Health Association, and others to say, other countries have done it, and Canada, I would argue, is falling behind. And as a principle, as a sort of a health equity principle, I think testing should be made much more accessible to individuals. And I think if nothing else comes out of this discussion, I hope people will find ways of getting in touch with their local MOH, their local politicians, or local whatever, to say, if the Government of Canada has taken upon itself to hold community-based organizations, clinicians, and everybody to this integrated approach, then we need to find innovative ways of actually actioning integrated approaches to testing. Okay, and I'll just stop there. Thank you very much for your time. Oh, thank you. It's a big check. I'm going to move to forward.
Yeah, you wish. Thank you very much, Jacqueline. For our next presentation, we have two presenters, Stephanie and Kim. They will speak on HIV care and treatment in Manitoba and an overview of the Manitoba HIV program. Stephanie Van Hoot is a Métis woman from Winnipeg who has practiced as a registered nurse since 2003. Since that time, she's had the opportunity to guide the work of many interdisciplinary healthcare teams in a variety of settings, both at home in North America and in sub-Saharan Africa. Currently, she is a program development officer for the Manitoba HIV program and is completing her Master's of Nursing degree with the University of Manitoba. Stephanie loves gardening, cooking, and swimming, and has 2 cats, 1 dog, and lives in Winnipeg. Kim Witges is the Director of Clinical Programs at 9 Circles Community Health Center. Kim was a public health nurse in the downtown Winnipeg for many years before returning to school to complete a Master's of Nursing that focused on administrative and leadership elements within nursing and healthcare. Kim is new to Nine Circles. In fact, I just met her today for the first time, and is keen to contribute to the ongoing work that enhances the lives of folks living with HIV in the community and provincially. Do we have a PowerPoint now? Do we have a PowerPoint?
Oh, hi, good morning. So I'm Stephanie. I don't know, I think I know quite a few people here, so it's a friendly crowd for me, which is great. I tend to get nervous when I speak, so if I start to lose my voice, I apologize. So we're here to talk about the Manitoba HIV program and a little bit about HIV here in the province of Manitoba. So let's get started. Ooh, well, I apologize. If some people have already had the opportunity to see many of these slides. It's kind of my 2016 epi spiel. I've traveled around a bit this past year giving this. So I just thought it would be important to provide a bit of an overview on HIV here in Manitoba. So if we look here, this first slide, it's looking at where people in Manitoba have HIV. And so this is the percentage of clients per region out of total number of people that are diagnosed. And what you can see here is that the bulk of clients are in Winnipeg, right there, with about 83%, and the rest are fairly evenly distributed throughout the province and all of the health authorities. The point of this is what? It's that HIV is everywhere in Manitoba. It's not just localized to the city of Winnipeg. This is another slide that shows the geographical distribution for clients new to care in 2016. And so what you can see here is the average age of people entering into care with the HIV program is 42 years old. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in the next few slides. And also, you know, not in line with what's happening nationally, it's about 31% of all new clients are female. And so that makes Manitoba a bit unique. So if we look at just the numbers game in terms of where clients are per each region, you can see in the Northern Health region, there's about 57 people, Southern's got 41, Interlake 64, and Prairie Mountain has 54, sorry. So like I said, there's fairly even geographical distribution outside of Winnipeg. We're sitting at about 1,350, I believe, for the province right now, of the number of people living with HIV. So, you know, it's small numbers all around, but it's important. And then let's talk about how that relates to testing. So our testing rates for the province overall are not great. In Manitoba, we're looking at about 5 to 6% of the population that receives an HIV test every year overall. That includes all people that are getting tested as part of their prenatal care plan, and so not necessarily targeted testing for those who are at risk. I'd like to just point out that the Winnipeg Health Region percentage of 8.2 is probably slightly inflated, and Prairie Mountain, Interlake Eastern, and Southern are probably slightly lower as a result of people traveling from those regions into the city of Winnipeg to get tested. This is done based on the clinic that did the test and not on the address of the people in terms of where they reside. So what does clients new to care in 2016 look like? About 70 people of the 103 that came into care into the program in 2016 were newly diagnosed here in the province. The rest either transferred on high-active antiretroviral therapy or transferred without medication. And as far as ethnicity goes, and this is probably really important for people that are interested in research and people that are interested in health programming, what you can see is that we have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people here in the province that are affected by HIV, and I'd be remiss not to mention that. Followed by our African, Caribbean, Black community, and then whites or Caucasians, and Asian and other. Risk exposure is interesting also in terms of Manitoba compared to what kind of goes on nationally. So what you'll see here is about 33% of people think that they contracted HIV through heterosexual sex here in Manitoba, with an additional 23% having probably had contact via heterosexual sex elsewhere in a country where HIV is endemic. But that's interesting because what you're seeing in other parts of the country are the MSM community and people who inject drugs being far more affected than what we are seeing in the province here. So when we're looking at prevention programming, as well as how we structure care and treatment services, that's important information to take into account. I'm going to pass this off to Kim right now, who's going to talk a bit about the Manitoba HIV program and how we're structured, and once you get diagnosed, what that kind of pathway into care looks like. So, Kim?
Thank you. Hi. Hello, everyone. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the Manitoba HIV program. So who we are. So the Manitoba HIV program was established in 2007, and it was really a partnership between 9 Circles and Health Science Center. And it wasn't until about 2016 when 7th Street Health Access Center in Brandon came on board. So right now our program has 3 sites. The overarching goal of the program is really to ensure that people living with HIV have access to the same standard of care and treatment, regardless of where you live in the province. Within that goal, that overarching goal, you may be familiar with the tagline, find, link, and retain. And what that really means is we also want to encourage testing, we want to ensure that we're linking people to services, and we want to help support them to continue living full and long lives. So what does that mean, and how do individuals get connected to care? Well, first we need to get individuals tested. We need to increase our testing awareness and the importance of testing. But once an individual is diagnosed with HIV, then the service provider is linked to what we call the Manitoba HIV referral program line. The referral program line is housed at 9 Circles. It's checked daily, twice. And so usually there's a return call within less than 48 hours. The voicemail on the Manitoba referral line will also prompt the service provider to check out the 9 Circles website, where they can download the Manitoba HIV referral form. They can start that process immediately. The referral form is then faxed back to 9 Circles, where it's then looked at, and we start to think about, through that clinician's lens, where's the best site for care for this individual. So how that is determined really is through the centralized referral system. So we use a centralized referral system because, for a few reasons, there's advantages that we can ensure that there's minimizes the risk of losing somebody to care. It also allows the sites to work together to develop a larger capacity to be able to support people and share resources among them. And additionally, there's a lot of similarities between the 3 sites, but there's also a lot of differences between the 3 sites. And that helps us have a broader view to be able to make sure that we're linking people with the most appropriate care. So how are the sites similar and how are they different? Well, we all use an integrated model. And what that really means is that all 3 sites are staffed with practitioners that have expertise in HIV care and treatment. So those practitioners include social workers, doctors, nurses, and often pharmacists. How the sites start to differ is both 9 Circles and 7th Street Health Access Center embed their HIV care in primary care clinics. So they're able to offer that community-based primary care with HIV services. How Health Science Center differs is that we also deal with a lot of people or support people who have primary care already in place for them. So Health Science Center becomes that specialized place where they go just for their HIV care and treatment. Both 9 Circles and 7th Street Health Access Center are community-based. And what that really speaks to is the fact that we know when we're working with specialized populations that they sometimes need a little bit of additional support in order to excel and enhance their HIV care and health. What health sciences can offer is they'll take the lead on supporting people who don't live within the city. So they fly into the city for care and treatment. And they'll also have a nurse practitioner on site. So if somebody does arrive from outside of the province that has a primary care need, they can also help them with that as well. Brandon also plays this role just because they're geographically based. So they'll also support people who don't particularly live in Brandon, but live close enough to Brandon that it makes more sense for them to get their treatment there than come to the city of Winnipeg. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the shared resources. The Manitoba HIV program will share resources. We have infectious disease specialists, we have HIV, obstetrics, and gynae care available. We have pharmacists at all 3 sites that are specialized in HIV medications. We have an occupational health therapist. We have a shared dietitian. We have outreach workers that are shared. We have a food bank that we can share. We also have health promotion and education material. We have Indigenous support, as well as access to clinical trials. So what does this really look like for somebody who is getting care? So we'll talk a little bit about an integrated care model and what it looks like in a community health center. So as I said before, we have primary care and the HIV care embedded with each other. And so what that means at intake for an individual is that they'll have the opportunity to meet with a social worker, the nurse, the physician, as well as the pharmacist if that's what's required. And it's really an opportunity to gain some information and to gather health information, but more importantly, it's an opportunity for the client to be able to talk about what their care plan should look like, what their goals and expectations are. And from there, we have the ability to start to individualize those care plans and piece together what makes sense for that particular person. So that could mean engaging with the occupational therapist. It could mean if there's food securities, linking them to the food bank. It also could mean that they would like some cultural support throughout their journey. And it could simply be actually just making sure that we can develop some consistency to their appointments, which means linking them to outreach. For Health Science Center and the Infectious Disease Clinic, they don't have that primary care piece, but they still have the opportunity to meet with the physician and the nurse and the pharmacist to start that. Their integrated model may look a bit different, but even through this journey, they may have questions around food choices, and we have the ability to link them with the dietitian to talk about some of that. Or, as I said before, sometimes things come up that are unexpected, and we can access the nurse practitioner. So although health sciences takes the lead on really supporting people who come from outside the city into the province for their HIV care and treatment, what I wanted to show with this slide is that we all play a role in it, that we have the ability to have some structure, but also the ability to have some fluidity to move in between. And we do things that make sense for the client as they unfold.
Okay, thanks, Kim. So this is kind of where I like to sit professionally, is looking at outcome measures, looking at numbers. We're not quite where we're going to be heading, but we do have some metrics that we use to evaluate the program and to do some planning. So the first one I want to talk about, and I kind of touched on it earlier when we looked at where testing was happening, is this concept of late presentation to care that's happening in Manitoba right now. Part of the Manitoba HIV program mandate beyond care and treatment is actually to help put some sustainable supports where people are at into testing, and as well as linkage to the program. And so what we're looking at here in this slide is, if we're looking at a CD4 count, and for those who aren't familiar, CD4 count, a low CD4 count means the lower the count, kind of the more immunocompromised you are, the more opportunity that you have to present sick with HIV or with AIDS, depending on where you're sitting at here. So what we're finding in 2016, for example, is that over half of the people presented with a CD4 count that was less than 350, which means that people were already immunocompromised when they entered the program. Half the people were maybe already experiencing some effects to their health that prompted them to get tested, and they weren't testing kind of upfront as opposed, I'll just keep going. And then outside of Winnipeg, it's about 42% of people that were tested with a CD4 count of less than 200. So these people, if they had any kind of presentation of symptoms of the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, they would be in line to have an AIDS diagnosis. And so that's quite concerning to the program, and why we really want to expand testing outside of Winnipeg. The good news, and if we were being optimistic, is since 2008, since the program's inception, the percentage of clients with CD4 counts less than 200 is trending in the right direction. And so we hope with greater access to testing and greater kind of promotion of prevention activities, we'll continue to see this number go down. The annual audit. So from 2008 to 2016, we like to take a look at all clients that enter into care with the program. And so this is just giving you some basic demographic information that we kind of went over in the first slide. And so this is just to look at where we are kind of flat overall, which is with our heterosexual exposure, as well as our Indigenous population, remains overrepresented. So Leigh McCarty, who spoke earlier this morning, works on a lot of our data analysis for this audit, and then also is looking at a care cascade for Manitoba. And we're trying to get one off the ground and get one going here in the province. And so for those that don't know, or maybe this isn't super familiar to you, UNAIDS put out some targets related to 90-90-90. You'll hear that rhetoric quite a bit around the HIV world here. And really what that means is it's a percentage of people that are, first of all, successfully diagnosed with HIV, and so they know their status. And then from those people, 90% of those people are placed on high active antiretroviral therapy, and of those folks, 90% of them have achieved a suppressed viral load or successful treatment. And so where we are with clients that were new to care in 2016, at least for their first year into treatment, is 97% at the time of the audit were successfully linked to our program. Of those, 92% were retained for their first year in care. Of those, 95% were placed on heart, and of those, 83% achieved a suppressed viral load. So what this is illustrating, or the whole point of this, I guess, is that once people get diagnosed, they actually fare quite well. And we should be celebrating that. And so there's sometimes concerns that if we do too much testing, that we're going to be creating negative outcomes for people. And I know that socially and other factors will probably determine that a lot more than the HIV program itself, which is actually doing a really good job at successfully placing people on treatment and supporting positive health outcomes. This is the same slide. So what we were looking at in June 2017 is for the program overall. So approximately 1,350 people in the province. Out of those people, 82% were virologically suppressed. So they were successfully on treatment and maintaining that. So that's great news. And then for 9 Circles specifically, they're seeing about the same thing as the program overall. And so that's it. That's all we have today. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to thank all the presenters for their great presentations this morning. And now it's time for you guys to do a little bit of work. So on your tables, you'll see that there's a sheet of paper, and it's called Thinking About What You Heard. And there's some questions on there. And just amongst yourselves at the tables, let's take about 10 minutes, and we'll discuss those questions. Put your answers on the sticky notes that are on the tables, and then you can take them up. If you look at the back of the room there, there's 2 papers on by where the posters are, and you can put the sticky notes up on those. So we'll give you about 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back.